welcome to the Divine Counsel Worldview podcast. Good to be with you again. And I'm Ron Johnson, Mike Chu again along with us. We should mention as we get into today's discussion of what's going on between Genesis, where we've just stopped or finished our study of Genesis together on the podcast. We're going to get into the book of John, verse by verse, again, working through the Gospel of John. And today's discussion will be bridging the information, or really the story between Genesis and John, so that when we drop into John 1:1, we have a context within or from which to work. So that's today's discussion. I would like to say going in, and we've not done this, Mike, and we should, and that is to, like many podcasts, stop and have a sponsor, right, or a mention of a sponsor or a commercial even. And there is a way. I mean, this whole podcast is being done through the graciousness of the Michael S. Sheiser Foundation. And we do this in honor of our good friend and colleague, Dr. Sheiser, who passed away, in 2023. And so we do this out of love for the text, of course, and the Lord and each other. But we really are also wanting always to keep in mind that we do have a sponsor, as it were, and that is the Michael S. Sheiser Foundation. Mention to the group how can people support the foundation, and in that sense support the podcast, Mike? So,
like Ron and I, Mel and Rich, we're the hosts of the DCW podcast, but this podcast project itself is part of the legacy work that the DRMSH, the Michael S. Sheiser Foundation has been working on for the past year. And so one of the best ways folks can actually support the foundation is to join up at the private community that was set up still while Dr. Sheiser, while Mike was actually still alive. He had created a website and a private community where folks can join, log in, and participate in more discussions about divine counsel, worldview, about ancient Near Eastern materials. And currently, those who are in that community, they're learning things not just from Dr. Sheiser, but also from you, Ron, right? With the daily dose of the Bible that you've been doing for, it's now been over a year at this point that you've been doing this. And so the best way that folks can join is to go to the drmsh.com website. And on the right side of that screen, there's a little button. Actually, it's not very little. It says join the community. And when you click on that, that will take you to the private community website where you can sign on, you can sign in, you can learn about what are the benefits of becoming a member of this private community. And these membership fees to go into the private community go directly to support the Michael S. Sheiser Foundation. It is a nonprofit. It is working on not just the podcast, but also on translation efforts of Dr. Heiser's work and on other projects as well, like several books that are being written right now. One being written by you, Ron, and another by another author that's going to be continuing the Facade series that Mike used to work on. And so we have a lot of projects that are going on within the foundation. And this is one of the best ways that folks can support the foundation is by joining this private community. You get to have insider notes. You get to hear about news, what the foundation's working on. You get to keep up to date with what is going on the broader sense of this community that we have found ourselves in. And so, I would encourage folks to join up at the DRMSH private community.
Right. And thank you for explaining all that. And when I signed on a while back, I forget that I'm a member actually, because I go on the app. There's an app, MSH or whatever the name of the app is, and it's right there on my first page on my iPhone. And I go there, at least every other day to see what's going on. So there's plenty of things happening, and that would be the best way to, again, if you want to support the podcast itself, that's how you would do it. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, today, let me begin by saying this, Mike, and again, I'd love your opinion back as an active preacher of the gospel. I'm not in that business right now. I'm not a pastor. I was for 15 years. And so I say this with that in memory, but here's where I am now. I bristle at the idea of quoting different parts of the Bible during a sermon. In effect, using the Bible as like a quote book, and I'll jump around. You know how it goes, where I'll quote a passage or a phrase, or the preacher will, from all parts of the Bible during in any given sermon. But the reason I find, and again, this is just me, I feel like it's using the Bible outside of its intended use. Yes, Paul quoted from the Old Testament here and there, but he was not doing it to define or defend a doctrine. He was doing it because as a Jew, you midrashically like to go back and find phrases that are part of your worldview. But, the development of a doctrine by going back and grabbing verses is very, very rare, actually, in the mind of Paul. And so, while in Genesis, for example, we said this last time, my mind likes to stay in Genesis. If I'm reading Genesis, I like to go to that book and travel to the book, and don't take a mental plane ride home every night asking how I can get back to the comforts I'm used to. But no, while I'm in Genesis, I drink the tea that's there. I stay in the foreign hotel that's in Genesis, as it were. I eat the foreign food that Genesis gives me, so that someday when I do return home, I will be a changed individual, but I won't be doing it back and forth. So, I don't know. I guess I'll stop there, Mike, but this idea of quoting or using the Bible as a quote book, I think it becomes, and again, this is from our last conversation, thinking of the Bible as a divinely authored book, as though one author wrote the whole thing. So why can't I jump around? Since God wrote the whole book, why can't I use God's book, as it were, to jump around and get what I need? I think that again is a presumption that people bring to the Bible that I personally don't have anymore. God, yes, is the author, but that doesn't mean that he meant it to be used in the way that some people do. So while stories and phrases and words from various parts of the Bible are part of my world, I grew up memorizing verses, and it's part of the mental furniture that I live with, in my head. I think it's much more important, and here's today's discussion. Here's where we're going today, and here's why I bring it up, that the inspired concept, or the concept of inspiration, the concept of accuracy, authority, is in the story the Bible's telling more than in just the words that I can pull out from various parts of the Bible. And that's what we're going to do today, is tell the story between Genesis and John. We'll use the text, but only in reference. Just say, here's where that part of the Bible is talking about that part of the story, that kind of a thing. All right. Have I given you enough to chew on and respond to?
Yes, well, that is my name.
Yeah.
What I would say is, I think metaphors are very important. And what you're describing is the typical, the very typical way that a lot of preachers tend to do. I mean, in the last episode I mentioned, when I did a survey over thousands and thousands of sermons, one of the things that, one of the 3 sermons that I found that even referenced the book of Job, 2 of those sermons were essentially doing what you were describing, Ron, where the preacher had 15 verses that he was using just in one sermon. He would just pop off another verse. And I typically call this is just simply using the scriptures as proof text. You already have an idea, and you're using the scriptures to buttress your idea, right? And for my training, and I think for your training too, because we had similar, bigger overarching preaching teachers, that the main thing that what we ought to be doing as preachers or as teachers of the text is to actually come to the text and ask the text, well, what is your idea? Instead of me imposing an idea upon the text, what is the text itself speaking of? And that is a much more in-depth process, right? When people think of the Bible, they think of one book and thus one divine author, sure. But I tend to think of it now more as a library. That whenever I do come to the thing that we call the Bible, it's really more akin to a giant library, and in itself is different genres of literature. You have narrative, you have poetry, you have letters, epistles, you have gospel narratives, you got apocalyptic materials. You got all these different genres that have their own different ways of rules for meaning, for conveying meaning, for communication. And if you just go at the scriptures with just assuming it's always going to be this, it's always going to be this type of literature, then our interpretations, the meanings that we draw from it, it may not necessarily be wrong, but I would say it's probably unwise and probably not as helpful as it could have been. I also remember about how in the more ancient days of the church, the teachers of the church didn't just quote one snippet or one little whimsical verse from the scriptures. Often, whenever they preached, they would read whole swaths of the scripture before their congregations because most of the congregations could not read. Right. And they depended upon the teacher and the preacher to actually read the words of the Lord to them because they couldn't read themselves. And so it was really, in many ways, their chance of hearing the scripture in context in large swaths of the story. And then the preacher, the teacher would actually go into the meaning of the story, what is going on, helping them understand the context, the background. Like it's fascinating when you look at the old homilies of the 1st, the 4th, 5th centuries, and you see both the Latin and the Greek fathers would quote huge swaths of scripture, more than we would ever do ourselves. And the reasoning behind it is because, well, I'm one of the few people here in the congregation who can read. Even Augustine, part of even how his process of becoming a teacher or a preacher within the church was because he was one of the few people who could read Latin. Mm-hmm. And the people in his church, when he was a new Christian and they came to him, it's like, can you read? Can you please read this to us? And mm-hmm. that lesson has always stuck with me. No matter however I may feel about Augustine's teachings or whatever else, what I learned from that moment is if you have been given education, if you've been given the blessing of a theological education, you're not supposed to use that just for yourself. Ultimately, it's supposed to be a blessing and a gift to the church. And good point. It was just like, so that's how, like I've moved away from the proof texting, and when I preach, I really try hard to stay on one passage, not a verse, a passage. Yeah. And that's what really we're going to describe do with John, what's going on with that passage.
And by the way, another quick story that I think of when I do John as a book, we did a Bible study in our neighborhood once. I think I told you the story, and we polled the families, where would you like to start? And Susan was hoping it would be John. But one person said, I've never really read the Bible. Could we start in Genesis? And so that was good. Kind of glad we can go back and do the whole thing. And I think we are so used to jumping around during a sermon or, on any given Sunday. The pastor says open to blank, open to this, open to that. And he's presuming that you know the story as you open up that text. And I don't want to do that yet. I want to come into John and land the plane ready to talk about the book. And even the meaning of the first verse is built upon hundreds of years of history that even are outside the Bible. So here we go. What I'm going to do, and I'm going to share a screen here and see if it works. This is available if you want, the Word version of this, we could send it to you. So Ronn Johnson 7@gmail.com, RONN Johnson, the number 7@gmail.com is always available to you to talk to me. And if you want this, I can send it. I'm going to walk through the story between Genesis and John, and a lot of verses are here, and that's why I'm going to put it on screen so you can, I'm going to go faster than your ability to copy all this out. But if you ever want to come back to it, here it is. By the way, the big story of the Bible, let's just talk very broad terms. Here's where I am. And I like to, this is again, giving away the entire story of the Bible when I say these three things, but the main narrative of the Bible includes three distinct plot lines. There's probably more than three, but the interconnectedness of three plot lines fascinates me. Number one, God's love for and enthronement of Jesus over his present and future creation. That's one huge theme. Number 2, God's formation of and blessing upon a family of human beings who are loyal to God and Jesus. Number 3, which is part of a divine counsel worldview 101, is God's judgment upon a group of divine beings who misuse their delegated authority. That's also a theme that is, again, weaving in and out, whether it starts in Genesis 3, 6, 11, whatever, as we've seen. And now, by the time you get to John, it's going to be part of the story as well. So here we go. Ready to go, Mike? Anything you want to add before we jump in?
No, I generally agree.
If we were sitting in, and I said this before, if we were sitting in a synagogue in, let's say, Ephesus, where the book of John maybe would have come, and here's how they would have enjoyed John as a book. It would have been brought up front to the reader of the synagogue, someone who could read, which is not everybody. I, as the person coming in, let's pretend I am a pagan. I'm not a Jew. And I have joined the synagogue because I am fascinated by Yahweh as a deity. I want to worship Yahweh. I have come to believe in Yahweh as opposed, or come to be loyal to Yahweh even. Let's say I'm a Cornelius of Caesarea. I have come to believe in Yahweh. I'm a righteous man. The book of Acts, chapter 10, calls Cornelius a righteous man. I think it means he simply was following the God of Israel. And as Cornelius would be given orally the book of John, let's say he raises his hand and says, I'm a Roman. I'm not even a Jew. Could you go back and just overview the story of Israel for me so I can make sense of why the woman at the well, story, or why Jesus cleanses the temple? These things that will occur in John have a background to them. And so that's what this is about today. Hopefully review for many people, but for anyone reading the book of John, I would say at least think through this. So, and I put numbers on them just to keep me going. We can refer to the number if we want to, but it's really just the history. So the story of told between Genesis and John goes like this. Number 1, Pharaoh enslaves the family. Coming out of Genesis, of course, Hebrews or Exodus 1, they are enslaved for 280 years, we learn. By the time you get to chapter 2, God reveals his name to Moses, or Moses is born. And then on the backside of the desert, when Moses is about 80 years old, we learn for the first time that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has a name. That name is the letters YHWH in Hebrew, traditionally pronounced Yahweh. We're not sure exactly. Sometimes the older versions, you've heard of Jehovah. It's the same word, but it's just a pronunciation issue. Mm-hmm. We think it means something like he causes to be. We're not sure. But anyway, that's the name Yahweh. And notice how late this comes in the biblical story. From what we can tell, he has been called the High God before this, God Almighty, things like that. The Most High God, whatever. But now he has a name. Stop me whenever you'd like to, Mike, and interject your understanding of the story of Israel that we're working through. Well, then Passover redeems Israel from slavery. Again, remember how the story goes. This would have been Pesach or Passover. Passover night was to be remembered as Israel's separation from not just Egypt, but from the concept of pagan influence. And so that now they can become a nation alone in the land. That's where they're going, the land that was promised again to Abraham back in Genesis 12. So Passover is a huge story in the life of Israel, that which is to be celebrated yearly, the Pesach celebration. At Sinai, Israel accepts Torah. Now, again, when they came out of the Red Sea, who is like Yahweh among the Elohim, goes the Song of Moses. Recognizing the gods of the nations, realizing that Yahweh is the God that has saved them. Many people do believe in Yahweh at this point, Exodus 14:31, but then there's some that doubt. And we learn that when he's up on the mountain, things do go bad. And the ways of Yahweh, Torah, is more, I like the word ways better than law, because we learned back in Genesis 26 that Abraham followed the Torah. Well, that must mean something other than written laws. And I like the idea of ways as a better understanding. Can
I bring up something that I think might also be worthwhile adding? I think that there's, yes, Israel accepts Torah, like they're at Sinai. There's the typical what we think as the Sinai covenant. But what always kind of catches me just amazed is that God already declared they were his people, right? Even before the giving of the law, right? Before he actually officially goes into the 10 words. And, it's that whole entire thing of, do you agree to this covenant? Because I already see you as my people. You are my people. That's why I did everything I just did. You're my treasured possession.
This is given after the choice of Israel. Absolutely. It's never a means of salvation. They never interpreted it that way. Right.
Yeah. My pastor likes to describe it as like almost like the wedding moment between Israel and Yahweh.
Yeah,
that it's,
fair enough.
Hey, you've seen me now prove myself all this time before. Do you want to now make this formal? Do you want to make this official?
Good. But what happens, it's a sad moment, is that Israel turns at the same time they're marrying Yahweh. They have a secret love affair with Baal. Remember this? He comes down from the mountain in Exodus 32, and they have a calf there, and there seems to be some kind of a confusion among the people as to which Elohim has been responsible for the Passover itself. And so it's a terrible moment in their early history. So again, we're not sure a lot going on here. They may have considered their God to be another common tribal deity. Again, so little is known about Yahweh at this point in Jewish thinking. They've just come through the waters of the Red Sea. They don't have a theology at all. And so they are Egyptian in their culture, in their religion, and their ideas about Yahweh have to be learned in time. So Number 6, God clarifies his jealousy. What's interesting is that this is beyond Genesis now. The story of Yahweh, the story of Israel turns a little bit here, because back in Genesis, you don't get the sense of jealousy like you do in Exodus. Singularity of worship will be required now. You do not mix gods. You don't have, the guy with the most gods doesn't win. That's not how it's going to work. And of course, it's for Israel's good that this has been given. But this jealousy concept comes out very strongly in Exodus 34 and other parts of the Torah. Number 7, God emphasizes loyalty above ritual. It's very easy, again, looking back, to think that Torah was about ritual. Here's how I'd say it. Torah concluded by confirming the priority of loyalty alone above ritual. Now, like a Mother's Day card, should you give your wife a Mother's Day, or should you give your mother a Mother's Day card? Yes. Do you have to? Think carefully. No. You could be in jail, or you could be at the bottom of a pit like Joseph, and that card never gets to your mother. She would understand, in other words. Loyalty trumps ritual, but ritual is important, and that's how they would have seen it. And so as we move into the story of Israel becoming a ritualized nation, don't ever lose fact of the necessity of loyalty first. And loyalty as a concept, as I note here, it's a binary choice. You don't have are you kind of 68% for Yahweh? No, you're either with him or against him. And Jesus will preach like this later. And where that starts in the story of Israel, you're either for me or against me, is back in the early days of Torah. And my very important point that, again, I think is part of the story is that humans have the ability to choose which deity they worship. That's part of the created nature of mankind, beyond the issue of sin and depravity and sin nature and stuff like that. I think humans, from what I can tell from the story of the Bible, you have a choice as to which deity you worship. And the Bible works with that story in hand. Number 8, God predicts national disloyalty. By the time you get to the end of Deuteronomy, this is kind of scary. He says, through Moses, by the way, everyone, this is not going to end well. And I think that should be mentioned as you start the story of Israel, that God knows, that they know that God knows, that loyalty as a national issue will have a debilitating nature to that. That story will have a bad trajectory. And yet individuals can be loyal, but the nation itself will, as it's predicted in Deuteronomy 28, God will rejoice to as it were, be wrathful against them for the sake of their disloyalty. It's a strange moment, but it's there. Okay. Number 9, ritual is explained. Here's where, yes, there's a lot of stuff in Leviticus and Numbers about sin and how to handle it. Kata is the Hebrew word. And notice how I say it. In ancient Near, and this goes beyond Israel. This is just ancient Near Eastern culture. Sin or mishap, kata is the Hebrew word commonly used, were considered to temporarily pollute the human condition, touching a carcass, having a discharge from your body. Those kinds of things are part of this discussion about how to live with Yahweh in a world that's dirty and dusty. And that's where these rituals are going to play out. It's the daily life stuff that a loyalist can do in ritual form to be part of Yahweh's family. But notice it's a ritual, and we often think or get this mixed up into what God's actually doing with salvation. No. This is never the ritual issues of Leviticus are for those who are already righteous. Leviticus 1:4, when you, the righteous person, implied, bring a sacrifice, here's what you do. But this is all part of ritual. It's never part of salvation in the mind of the loyal Jew.
I think it's worthwhile for folks to understand that, yes, this essentially, even going back to that Exodus 19 moment, you're my people, right? Yeah. You are my people. You're not performing the ritual to become my people. You're performing the ritual because you are my people. And this is what my people, the culture of my people, this is what you guys do. And it makes sense because it's actually even kind of more amazing to me is that you have a God, Yahweh in this case, actually declaring, I don't just want special people to be in my presence, like the king or the priests. I actually want all of you, like all the people, to actually be in my presence. And that's crazy. Like it used to just be with other gods who would be like, oh, it's only the special ones. The pharaoh or the king or the special priests. No, it's actually like everyone needs to be, I want you guys to be in my presence. And
and this is how that presence, and we're going to get to sacred space in a moment, is clarified for the righteous Jew. Good. Number 10, moral behavior is clarified. Here's, again, something to understand when it comes to the laws of Israel. Ancient Near Eastern nations, all around Israel, often codified idealized rules of moral behavior. The Code of Hammurabi existed before Torah. And the point is that this idea, and here it is in my second point, these laws, including the ancient Near East, like Code of Hammurabi, often defined hoped-for obedience, serving as a political platform for the king. So it's not like you have to do it. It's like, again, that Code of Hammurabi was not used like we think of American and British law, where if I speed, I have to pay a fine. They used it as a platform. Here is what we stand for in this city. Will they punish you if you don't? Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. That's just history. So that's how they saw the laws of Israel coming out of, again, Numbers, Leviticus, and those kind of things, in Exodus. These are hoped for, like a political platform for what Yahweh stood for these people as they were entering into their own territory to become their own nation. It was something that every nation did, including Israel. I do find it interesting that God did raise the bar for many moral improvements within his own Torah compared to the Code of Hammurabi and other ancient law codes that we have found.
Oh, yeah. And I think, that's again, like, this is what happens as moderns, is that we take, I've tried to not use the word laws very much in my preaching. I tried to use the word instructions or wisdom because of our tendency that when we hear the word law, we immediately think of a legalistic criminal court type of thing. Right. Versus these were like, this is, if you're my people, if you're the people of Babylon, this is what Babylonians are like. This is how they're ideally like, for example. And so, it is like a political platform, but it's also like, this is what we think the idealized version of a human being should be.
Exactly.
And should think of and act like, and this is how you're of this nation, of this kingdom. And
Yeah, beautiful.
this is the
and
same
that's
thing
why
of
Proverbs was written. Proverbs is also, it's not law, but it's also part of that platform. Here's what a wise man does.
Yeah.
Who is part of our community.
Mhm.
Good. Number 12, rebellion is disallowed. Here's a very important point made and even exemplified by a story tucked into Numbers chapter 15, where a man is killed for picking up sticks on the Sabbath. But read that whole chapter and you realize it's a high-handed sin. That's a physical picture that's caused by the Hebrew language. To sin against God with your fist raised in his face, as it were, that's totally unallowed in Israel. So there are no sacrifices for murder, adultery, kidnapping. And that's why we don't have a tit for tat payment for sin model. That's never part of the Israelite system. And again, it's part of our modern heritage that we think that sin was being paid for, even if temporarily, by these sacrifices. I think that would be horrific to the mind of the loyal Jew. He never thought of his rebellion, his possible rebellion, as being forgiven through a sacrifice. That's not how they did it. And again, just read Leviticus for a more even-handed and careful understanding of what kinds of sins were taken care of in the sacrificial system. Mm-hmm. Israel wanders for 40 years, getting back to just a historical issue that everyone would have known. For 40 years, again, because 12 spies came back and said, let's do it. Well, 10 of them, how many was it? 10 of them said, no, we're not going to go. And 2 of them said, let's go.
Yep.
Israel was sentenced to wander Sinai for 40 years, killing off the entire generation of disbelieving Israelites. It's a huge part, again, of our story. Well, then again, by the time we come to Joshua, we learn in the book of Joshua that he defeats Canaan, goes in, and after he meets the commander of Yahweh's army, an interesting story in Joshua 5, he is given the directions for how to handle Jericho and other cities, and they basically defeat the Southern Confederacy, and then within a couple verses, you get the whole Northern Confederacy destroyed. So, interesting storyline again that I think not part of John. John will have no exorcisms, interestingly, but it does posit Satan as the antagonist that Christians are against. Where is that story? It's all built into, I believe, the genocide story of Joshua, where he was cleansing not just sinful people out of the land. He was cleansing Elohim infection. In some sense, you have a Nephilim story again that comes back into play. Too much for our conversation here. But I think in the mind of the Jew, why did we wipe out certain people groups within Canaan? It wasn't because they were just wicked. It was because they had some kind of infection going on that mirrored the Genesis 6 story. And again, it's more than we can talk about. But anything you want to mention there?
I think I'm not sure if the word infection is the best way of describing it, because
it fit on the page.
All of a sudden we start bringing in like blood science.
No, yeah.
I think, I mean, one of the things I had learned over the last couple of months about the word that's typically, people assume, oh, this is a genocidal command, a harem. The word has the broader meaning of essentially rendering useless.
Sure.
And thus, because what we know is that, well, not every person in Canaan who was part of these particular people groups, they were not all wiped out. But what ultimately happened was the whole entire infrastructure was taken down. In the conversation we had on the other podcast that I work on, Dr. Matthew Lynch, one of the things he brought up was how a lot of the Canaanite cities, they had these tentative alliances with Egypt. And in many ways, these fortifications, these cities were often connected to military fortresses that were connected to the empire of Egypt. And
Sure.
Thus, this interesting takedown of these cities rendered the entire military operation of Egypt in the Promised Land nullified.
Nice.
And so it was a very interesting thing. So it's not necessarily like a genocide as we would think of, like, what happened with World War II with
Right.
Hitler and the Jews, but we are going to essentially disable and dismantle the entire military structure and breakdown that Egypt will have no influence upon this land.
Right. And I would be more careful, I guess, if I was to say this again. the people groups that they were told to utterly wipe out so that they didn't breathe would have been those elements of the Gathites, and the remnants of the Rephaim, shall we say. And that, again, brings up a whole conversation as to who they would be. But there seems to have been a recurrence of Nephilim in the story at this point, and that gets into the conversation anyway about the defeat of Canaan. So we move on. David is chosen as king. Now, the story goes like this, that the people wanted a king, and God allowed them to have a non-Yahwist. I don't believe Saul was a Yahwist from everything we can tell. And in fact, it even says in Chronicles that God killed him for his disloyalty. So I take it that was a major issue between him and God, Saul and God and Yahweh, or I'm sorry, Yahweh and Saul, was that there was no loyalty of Saul toward Yahweh. And so what he does is he puts David in his place, and David then, of course, unifies the nation, moves the capital to Jerusalem, and we have David as the high point, at least in theory, of the nation of Israel because of his loyalty to the God of Israel. For the first time now, we have a nation that is under a Yahwist. David, of course, models loyalty. I don't think his behavior is good in some levels, right? He seems to be a wise, almost shrewd, often cruel warrior. He has 10,000 murders or killings on his resume, we find. And yet he is to be appreciated beyond Saul and others. Why? Because God, it says that God's heart desired David. He's a man after my heart. My heart wants him. And I think it's because, again, of his understanding of what faith and righteousness was, and he did what an Abraham did. He simply chose Yahweh. Read the Psalms, and you'll get a sense of loyalty par excellence, beyond any of his peers. David knew what it was to yell at Yahweh, worship Yahweh, question Yahweh, doubt Yahweh, but always worship Yahweh. He never went to another deity. And that's the issue that I think we need to pull from David's life, as here is the ultimate loyalist, at least in the physical realm, that we have met to this point in the biblical story. So,
David is such.
Yeah, go ahead.
David is he's a man of so many tensions, and but yet the most clarifying thing about him is that his heart was for Yahweh alone. Yahweh was his God. Versus how Saul often would describe Yahweh as your God, Samuel, your God, and he never made Yahweh his own. And besides Jonathan, the rest of his children, at least the names that we get of his other sons, they're all named after a variation of Baal. It's weird. You have the king of Israel who's supposed to be leading the worship of the God of Israel, and yet he is naming his children after Baal.
I know. That's a fascinating story. I wish more commentators, as you read Samuel commentators or commentaries on 1 Samuel, I wish they'd get into that conversation of at least wondering whether Yahweh or Saul was a Yahwist. It seems to come up very rarely as even a conversation among evangelicals. And to me, it's the key to the whole story. Well, Solomon, this is interesting to me. Let me give you my opinion, Mike, and see if you agree. Solomon's crowning achievement, he's the son of David, was a lavish temple. Nothing was seen like it before or since, right? I think Yahweh yawned when he saw it. In other words, he said, well, that's really nice. And even Solomon admits, you're too good to even dwell in this temple. You inhabit the heavens of heavens. Why would you even think of coming here? And I think Yahweh's response to this great, beautiful temple was, and this is important for John, the book of John opens with Jesus going in and cleansing the temple. Why? Because, think of this whole story so far. God wants loyalty. God wants your heart, whether you're sitting on the side of a hill like a David, or if you're a Solomon building a lavish temple, he still wants your heart, though, okay? So he'll appreciate a beautiful temple, but he'll yawn, and he'll say, let's wait and see what happens. And here's where it comes. Solomon marries foreign women. 1 Kings 11:6. They turned his commitment from Yahweh. I'm not going to blame the women. I'm going to blame Solomon. But as he married these women and they brought in their their idols and such. The story of Solomon is a lack of loyalty. It's not the temple. And yet it's going to be a physical structure that causes people to visit Israel and for Jews to be proud of their nation and even their temple. But Jesus will look at that when you come to John 2, he's going to walk into that place and say, this is a den of thieves. The whole story of what's going on here is unnecessary to the worship of Yahweh. And so that's my call on Solomon, that he thought he was, and he gave Yahweh a nice house, but Yahweh yawned and said, yeah, I've seen nice things before, and I'll see them again.
Well, I mean, I guess two thoughts, right? And also to clarify for some folks is that the temple that Jesus cleanses is often referred to as the second temple, right? Solomon builds the first temple, which, I mean, if we were to compare, even artist renditions of Solomon's temple versus the second temple or Herod's temple, even I would yawn at Solomon's temple in comparison to the second, because the second is complex. It became this giant, huge complex that housed so many different activities and things and courts and whatnot, and really was more of a reflection of Herod's, luxurious tastes, if anything, versus Solomon's. And
we'll get there to Herod in our story. But
I do also think that
you said there are two things you were going to bring up, right?
Yeah, the second thing I think is it's interesting, right? I think he began his kingly reign. I mean, this is after all the chaos with what was going on with his brothers, with all his other half brothers, right? And even how he came into reign was just full of intrigue. But ultimately, he was also fulfilling the heart desire wish of his dad. It was David who wanted to build this temple richly, and Yahweh basically said, no, you can't. You have too much blood on your hands. Right. And but I appreciate the thought. Your son will do it, and so in some sense, Solomon was. I think there, at least in this point, at that moment in time, he had a lot of motivations. Yes, to honor Yahweh, but also my dad wanted to build this temple, and I want to honor my father. Mm-hmm. And, and yes, there's all these other pluses that come along with it. The prestige, the people will marvel at this beautiful architecture and whatnot. He started off well.
But I always wonder if he's a Yahwist. I mean, you got to wonder from his story how, this, when we talk about eternal security, it doesn't mean you can say a prayer and guarantee your future. It means if you follow Yahweh, you're safe. There's your eternal security. If you follow this deity, you are safe. You're saved. You're righteous, whatever. But I
guess I wonder. I mean, it all depends. I think on that question is really, what do you think? Who do you think was maybe one of the sources of the Book of Ecclesiastes? And however a person answers that may lend to one way or another. Because he does end with the loyalty. You're right.
Yep. And we got to move on, but you know what happens, right? Everyone who's sitting in the synagogue that we're pretending to sit in, remember what happens? Idolatry divides the kingdom. There we go. Rehoboam succeeds Solomon. Jeroboam, the military, he was a builder, but now he becomes the leader of the 10 tribes to the north. He establishes cult centers up in Dan and Bethel to make sure people don't go down and worship Yahweh. And this whole mess of the divided kingdom is not because of sin. It's not because of justice or, misuse of the coffers of the temple or, just social justice issues. It's deep-rooted idolatry and lack of loyalty to Yahweh that really despoils the entire affair. Because of that, hurrying up through our story, Assyria comes in 722 and takes the top, the northern 10 tribes. It does say in 2 Kings 17, it was Jeroboam caused Israel to commit the, quote, great sin of serving other Elohim. So there it is. The reason for the conquering of Israel by Assyria was not, again, just general evil. It was the willingness to align with gods of the nations. And God basically is saying, well, if you want other gods, you can have them. And here's how it's going to work. I'm going to have Assyria come in and destroy you. They do not destroy Jerusalem. They get turned back by a miraculous act of God, because in Jerusalem at that time was a Yahwist. His name was Hezekiah. So it's going to be several years later, 130 some years later, that Babylon finally, though, comes in and destroys or conquers Judah, including Jerusalem. And this is the end officially of the Israelite nation, 586 BC. Notice again, 2 Kings 23, idolatry is the reason. It's not, again, just general sins. There were reforms coming and going after Assyria came through. But now, for the final time, idolatry has become the norm in Israel. And so Judah falls to Babylon in 586, and it has forever been noted as not just the destruction of the temple, but the destruction of everything that Jews understood to be part of their lifestyle, which is my next point. And this is huge to me, and this is why John will sound the way it does, especially like listening to Jesus talk to the woman at the well when he says, it's not the hill you worship on that matters. And I'm not going to keep going through John in my mind, which it wants to go through. But here's a big point. Sacred space was destroyed in 586. When Judah was conquered, its temple was destroyed, holy articles taken away off to the king of Babylon. Thus, in one moment, Israel lost use of her priests, sacrifices, altars, and means of atonement. This whole concept of atonement was done as a ritual in 586. So now we look back upon the story. Let's pause in a moment and look, think of the people listening to our story. When did God institute ritual that had to do with, let's say, sacrifice for sin? It was after the book of Genesis. And it ends in 586. So it's only about 900 years of time in the history of Israel that we even had the sacred space concept of sacrifices and priests and so forth part of the story. We don't have it in Genesis. We don't have it after 586. So it's a parenthesis in the life of Israel. Sacred space, meaning priests, sacrifice, altar, that sort of thing, shows up to be not the purpose of God in Israel, but a parenthesis within the story, a bigger story of the family of Israel. And the story of loyalty will be much bigger than the parenthetical story of sin and sacrifice. That's why, to me, when you get to Hebrews, and I'm jumping ahead in the story, but I just have to say it now, Hebrews 7 through 10 is, yes, about sacrifice and how Jesus is the sacrifice. But remember, Hebrews 11 is about faith. What is the bigger story that even the author of Hebrews wants to leave you with? It's the bigger story of how loyalty works, not the temporary 900-year story of how sacrifice worked. Okay?
Can I mention one thing as well?
Yep.
Well, actually, probably two things. When people hear us saying the word idolatry, Ron, right, I think the tendency is to think of like the statues, the things of metal or wood, and not realize when we're saying the word idolatry, we're meaning the worship of the other gods. Yeah. And that they were giving northern Israel and then eventually southern Israel is exposed for doing the same, which is that they were not allegiant to Yahweh alone. And in northern Israel's case, they were pretty much their whole history as a nation was never allegiant. they were giving their loyalties to other Elohim, other gods. Judah, on the other hand, their kings, every so often there would be a king who actually was trying to emulate David and who was trying to lay his loyalty down before Yahweh alone. But that itself was only just like a temporary stopgap. But when we're using the word idolatry, that's what we're meaning. We're not talking just about that they like to create little objects made of metal and wood, but that they were actually actively worshiping and giving their loyalties and allegiances to other divine beings who are not the creator.
Yep. Was there a second point? You said there were two.
Well, the second thing I think is like, yes, the sacred space is destroyed, the temple, the articles, everything, the whole entire role of the priests, they found themselves now without a temple to serve in. But what I always find just shocking is that within the book of Ezekiel, as he is seeing like this prediction, essentially he's giving what's going to eventually happen is that the temple would be destroyed. And that the nation of Jerusalem, the nation itself, Jerusalem, will fall. And yet he sees the cloud that's supposed to represent the presence of God, the very actual thing that the temple was supposed to house and welcome and have in. And yet it flies off towards Babylon.
Towards Babylon, yeah. A place without a temple. Yep.
A place without a temple, and that it's not that, yes, I'm sending you my people into exile. And then like God is like, you could almost get the impression of like, I'm going to turn my back on you. You're sent off into exile. I don't care about you anymore. And yet the cloud, his presence, heads off to Babylon too. That's like, yeah, I'm sending you off into exile, but guess what? I'm coming too.
I'm going to be there. Yep.
And that, it's like, yes, you lose all the sacred things. You lose the sacred space. You lose the sacred articles, the rituals, everything, but you still have me.
Yeah.
I'm still coming with you. And that
brings us right into this next point. Yeah. That Jews live in exile. They don't have the sacred space, but they have God. God's there. Daniel's a good example of that. So I didn't want to cut you off, but that's, you're talking about my next point here. God's love for Israel remained with a return to loyalty forecast in the future. This new covenant is coming, and it's described while they're going through the end of the first covenant, that they're told about a second one. A new covenant's promised. This is only in Jeremiah where the phrase new covenant appears. Here's what I think it means. This new covenant would succeed because the people would be and remain faithful. The only difference is that the second one will work. That's what we're told. Their sins will be forgotten, their loyalty will be established, and there will be a consistency on the coming from the people that was not there before. How that's to be done, we're not told. I think that's where Jesus will fit in beautifully, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. So a new covenant is coming, but we don't know when. In Daniel, this is again so key to understanding before we get to John. A human is appointed to rule with God. While in exile, the young Daniel was apprenticed to be a Babylonian officer. He envisions in Daniel 7 a son of man, that's clearly trying to say in Aramaic, a human being, enters God's sacred throne room uninvited. And the divine council seems to be a group of loyal Elohim surrounding Yahweh, bring him to Yahweh, and the surprise is in 7:14, where this human being is given dominion, glory, and an eternal kingdom. The promise is given to a human being that he will someday be, by Yahweh's decree, given the kingdom. Now, is that only a human? No, I didn't say that. I'm just saying that the story, as we're living through it at this point in the story of Israel that we're learning about prior to John, is that God will someday use a human being to be the ruler of the entire world, not just Israel, but the entire world. Stop me if you want. A remnant remains loyal. Here's something that's going on behind the scenes, again, as we get ready to move between the testaments. The prophets had predicted that a small group of Jews would remain loyal. We call that the remnant, which is just leftovers in vocabulary meaning. But people like Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and others seem to be remaining loyal to Yahweh, even while the vast numbers of people that were in Babylon probably worshipped Marduk and other gods of that nation. Number 26, big point, again, it's not stated in the Bible, but it's part of the story of Israel. Torah is re-examined. They needed to reconsider how to serve Yahweh on foreign soil and among foreign people. This required a reinterpretation of Torah without temples, priests, sacrifices, and all those things that they did. And this is the beginnings then of words like rabbi and synagogue, scribe. Those ideas come from this time period where, and even the word Talmud, which is going to be finalized, as an idea back, after Jesus is come and gone. But the concept of studying the Bible without sacred space, trinkets at your fingertips, that's the concept of Talmud. How do we interpret the Bible without a temple even helping us worship Yahweh? Judah is recolonized. We know this at the end of the Old Testament. About 50,000 Jews return to Judea through Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah. They do make, as you mentioned, a smaller version of Solomon's temple is erected, and they reinstitute Yahwistic worship to that small temple with a limited Levitical system. Remember, they don't have an ark in there, so they're not going back to a full-fledged Levitical system. They never do. Even Herod, and we're getting there in a moment, does not reinstitute the book of Leviticus. That's sometimes a rumor that God wants Leviticus back in the temple. Nobody tried to do that. They had a limited version of it, and again, that comes from the study of Talmud, how to put this together without even an ark.
Can I?
Here's a big one that's again part of John's mental framework. The furniture that's in the book of John comes from this idea: Gentile destruction is assumed. Since Passover, Israelite religion assumed that Jews were to remain separate from Gentiles. Exodus 12. When you have Passover, Gentiles are not allowed in. And it says it in Exodus 12. Yahweh worshiping Gentiles could join Israel, but they would have to proselytize in order to do that. So the point is, if you want to join the family of Abraham, you must become a Jew. You cannot stand outside the house, as it were, as a Gentile and expect to be treated as a Jew. You've got to join the family, join the house, and in so doing, stop being a Gentile. And what would happen to all Gentiles? Well, here's the story again being told. It's within the Psalms, it's in the prophets, that all non-Yahwistic Gentiles would become subservient to Israel or be destroyed in the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord is a later prophet concept of God's wrath coming down upon the world for their disloyalty. And that's a very Gentile concept, or it's Gentile in the sense of who is God going after? He's going after those who are non-worshiping, or they're non-Yahwists, thus Gentile. And so the idea of Gentile destruction is built into the concept even of a Messiah. Messiah is going to destroy Gentiles. And I bring this up now as an important point because in John 3:16, the most famous verse in the Bible, is followed by John 3:17. I did not come to destroy the world. Well, they thought he would. That's the point. John 3:17 is exactly said because that's why Nicodemus thought that the purpose of the Messiah was to destroy the world. How did he get that idea? He got it out of the Old Testament. So there, go ahead.
It might be worthwhile to also just clarify for the listeners and folks watching this that we're saying this is the mental space of John's John's time period of how they came to certain assumptions, why they were sometimes confused by the words that Jesus was speaking about, because especially after Babylon, there was this growing almost a xenophobic attitude amongst certain factions of Jews within this time period that really appalled and had a not just a dislike, but they had a very we have to purge the Gentiles, or we have to purge Greco-Roman culture and influence and thought from our people
because of its idolatry. Absolutely.
Yeah, but they went to such an extreme. A resource I was going to mention in the last point was that if folks are interested in learning more about the intertestamental period or the Second Temple material time period, a great book that I've been loving and just going back to every so often has been a book by George Athos, an Australian scholar who wrote a book called Bridging the Testaments.
Yeah, I just have it in my library. Last month I picked it up. It's
cool.
And
he just focuses on like what typically people would think as the 400 years of silence, and yet his contention is the prophets were not silent, and that conception of silence was even something that was brought about by, ironically, rabbinic Judaism in the 3rd and 4th century, because they had a distaste or dislike of the idea that God was still speaking after Malachi, because if that meant God was still speaking after Malachi, then
let's talk about that. That's my point here, that there is this understanding that in the book of Maccabees, for example, the idea that a prophetic voice is yet to be heard, or that it's gone among us. I take this to mean we're kind of back where we were. Remember the 270 some years in Egypt. We didn't have a prophet then. The book of the Judges, it's a mess for 300 some years, where There's periodic loyalty, but it's very short-lived. And so this idea of silence is not that God can't talk, it's that he doesn't have an active prophetic voice. The reason that's important is because, as John will show, and let's keep moving along, you could guess, when John the Baptist shows up, there's going to be this anticipated, finally, we have the voice of God back in our midst. So that's where I'm going with this silent idea, that there was no official prophetic voice after Malachi.
Well, I guess that's where I've been coming around to this concept that it's not as official.
Okay.
It's just there. It's unfortunately not recorded because they were suppressed.
Okay.
So if I can read just this little quick quote here from Athos. This is on his. It's in his page 4 of his Bridging the Testaments book, and he mentions because he cited John the Baptist is a prophet. You have folks like Ananias. And I can't remember, like they were the two people that met Mary and Joseph as Jesus was being circumcised and they were sacrificing pigeons.
Yeah. Simeon, Anna.
Simeon. And so he brings up like there are prophetic voices that still exist, but there was something specifically going on with the prophetic voices that they were being suppressed.
Okay.
And so he points out here, Jesus did not believe that God had stopped sending prophets or interacting with his covenant people for several centuries. On the contrary, Matthew's gospel has Jesus state that, quote, all the prophets in the law prophesied until John the Baptist, Matthew 11, verse 13. The fact that the prophets are placed ahead of the law and John is counted as one of them means that Jesus was not referring to the books of the canon, but rather to the historical phenomenon of prophets. He saw a crescendo of sorts with the advent of John the Baptist, but never suggested that there was a cessation or pause of prophets before him.
Okay, interesting study. I'd have to read that and think about that. Good point. Mm-hmm. And let's think about number 29. That's a fair idea. We'll go on to Israel fights for independence. This is not in your Bibles, really. This is something that, again, those living in John's day would have known. Political tensions ran high while Judea lived under foreign powers, whether it be Persia, Egypt, Syria, and others, and Greece. And so here's the story. This is not in your Bible. The rural Jewish priest Mattathias sparked an uproar, and guerrilla warfare ensued, and the Seleucid Empire was the enemy. This is 167. It caused Hanukkah to become a Jewish holiday in 164. The point is the Hasmonean dynasty provided 100 years of Jewish self-rule until 63, when Rome came into town. So the point is that Israel knew what it was like to be independent, albeit only through guerrilla warfare, basically, from 167 to 63 BC. So they knew what it was like to be independent, although they were still suppressed. And that independent spirit, that desire to have someone like a Mattathias or the Maccabean revolt, the whole concept is part of the Jewish mindset coming into the days of Jesus. This will be Simon the Zealot, those people who still want to push back against Rome. Where did it come from? It came from the period between the Testaments mostly. During this time, Jewish purity is what I call recognized. There is this sense that, there is an exponential growth of Jewish purity laws, even though they don't have their own temple, as it were, or, it's kind of in ruins or it's very small. The idea of determining God's family now will kind of adapt this idea that, we are the ones who follow these rules. And so family rules, family traditions, hand washing, who to have dinner with, who not to have in your home, those kind of, questions of purity are far beyond what Leviticus talk about. Now it's going to be just the traditions of the elders. And that's how, again, the world into which Jesus walks will be driven by questions of purity, not based on Exodus and Leviticus, but they'll be based on scribal traditions that Jesus himself will say are far beyond what Yahweh ever had intended for his people. Big point again, that's not in our Bible, but it's very important, is that Herod paganizes the temple. Herod will expand the temple to, as you said, many football fields. It's going to be a huge complex. The problem is that he brings in non-Jewish priests to that temple. They're Mesopotamian, they're Egyptian, they're not even Jewish. And so when you have, here's the mental picture you have to have coming into John. Jesus sees the temple in the distance. He's going to, in a lot of stories of John are in Judea, as opposed to the synoptics that are mainly up in Nazareth. But when he comes up to that temple and he sees the glittering gold and so forth, he is not thinking religious thoughts. He's thinking, this is not a Yahweh's house. There is an emblem of Rome at the top, a seal of the eagle. All of that is designed to say the gods of Rome are really invested in this place, not the God of Israel. So that's the story behind the temple that Jesus will someday walk into. But it's important also to catch, and I think, again, John is not mistaking this, that a small number of righteous people are already in the story before Jesus comes. How can you have righteous people hold the baby Jesus? And the story is very clear that Anna and Simeon and Joseph and Mary and Zacharias and Elizabeth, they're already righteous, and Jesus hasn't come yet. Well, that's because the story is, same as Genesis 15:6, the way to be righteous is to be loyal to Yahweh. So there are a small number of Jews who are loyal to Yahweh, and they will be there to welcome the baby Jesus ultimately. Notice what I say here, the ultimate goal of this Messiah, Jesus, would be to save Israel from her sins. But notice the sins we're talking about, Matthew 1:21, would be the ancestral sin of idolatry. He is going to save the nation from their idolatry that they're bringing into the book of John in chapter 1. 2 more and I'm done. John announces the Messiah, and now we're ready to walk into the story of John. It's in John 1, so we'll see it. But John the Baptist was widely recognized, and here's where, that book, I'd have to read it and see his point, that the first prophetic voice since Malachi, we'll put it this way, John the Baptist quotes Malachi, and people see him being the fulfillment of Malachi 3, that he is the messenger who is to come to bring the nation to Yahweh, as it were. Yeah. And of course, remember what John does. He says, the Messiah is here. I'm not sure where he is, but he's about to come. And notice the story of John. This is more in the Gospels than in John or the Synoptics. But John will say, you people are venomous snakes. You're children of vipers. You're not even loyalists. God could make loyalists out of these stones over here. They could make them into the family of Abraham, meaning you're not. And so John's audience, and thus Jesus's audience, they're not Yahwists. And what Jesus has come to do is pull them back into the fold, those that want to come, as a shepherd would do. And so anyway, that's, again, very key, where Jesus is not joining a family of Yahweh loyalists who are under the thumb of Rome. He is joining a family of non-loyalists who think they are, but they're not. And so that very tense words that are going to be exchanged between Jesus and the Jews, that's the phrase that John will use, usually meaning the leadership, is going to be pointed to John 8:44, people who Jesus calls children of the devil, and they are not Yahwists, even though they come across as being loyalists to those who follow them. And now we turn to John 1, and this will be our conversation next time. What is a theos? What is a theos? Well, that's a huge topic that I want to talk about, because what happens in John 1:18, you have this phrase, Jesus is a unique theos who is in the bosom or came from the bosom of the Father. And so whatever we think about deity, it's going to have to work through the concept of theos in the New Testament. That's the primary word that sits in for Elohim of the Old Testament. But that's our next step in the process. And as we drop into the book of John, we're going to take one whole podcast and talk about what is a theos? How does it compare to an Elohim? So that'll be next time. But anything you want to add, Mike? We've used our time here, and we've walked between this. We've walked over that story again. The person asking almost innocently, "Can you tell me the story of Israel?" between Genesis and John, that was an hour, and I wonder how long they would have taken. But that would be my hour if I could. I would certainly want them to do it, not me. But if I today was given an hour to say what's the story between Genesis and John, there it was. So, anything you want to add?
I think it was a pretty good summary of just like, it's like covering a few thousand years of like history. I think if anything I would like to add and contribute to that is simply, it's something that, Dr. Sheiser had brought up, and really because he got the concept, I think, from also like Dr. Alan Siegel, was that it wasn't that there was a monolithic, uniformed Second Temple Judaism. There were Second Temple Judaisms, because every group of Jews within that time period, they had a different answer on why in the world were we sent into exile.
Mm-hmm.
And so you had those who assumed, oh, it's because we just were not keeping to the Levitical laws, or we weren't keeping to the Sabbath, we weren't keeping to the purity rituals properly, so that's why we were sent off into exile. And others will have, it's because we have too much Greco-Roman influence in our lives. We have too many people who are not Jewish living amongst us, and we have to purge them. Like you have all these various different answers, and as you pointed out, it seems to be that the New Testament writers, in particular John, is thinking, no, it's our tendency, our propensity to seem to worship other Elohim.
Right, it's much bigger than that.
Yeah, like our loyalty isn't to Yahweh alone. We have all these divided hearts that go after the powers of other gods. Why? And so I find it fascinating that it's a very clarifying and very simple question. Will you worship and follow the Creator? And you think the answer would be easy, and that it would be easy to implement, but it doesn't seem to be.
So that was my point in putting together those events, was to, I hope, clarify that God is still the God of Genesis. He's not changing his ways. It's a Genesis 15:6 paradigm now laid over the course of human history between, again, all the way up to John. And that is, if you love Yahweh, you're fine. You're you're safe, you're loved, you're covenanted with the creator and sustainer deity. Wow. Well, what happens in the story is the nation doesn't do it. Now, there are individuals. There's going to be a David. There's going to be, a Hezekiah. There's going to be good stories, independent stories. But the basic story of the nation will be they gave in to the worship of other neighboring deities. And so that's why the exile. That's why, again, walking into John, what would it be like to live in a world of a pantheon of Greco-Roman deities now from which to choose, and demons? John has no exorcisms, interestingly, but of course the synoptics do. And Jesus will, in John 8, for example, show Satan to be the antagonist that he's really opposed to, and that the the leaders of Israel have aligned themselves with Satan. And so the story will have come from, the Old Testament, but it's going to be dropped into we're dropping into a world that's Old Testament in thinking, but it's Greco-Roman in the roads and in the, the concrete that's around them is Roman. But the concept of following other gods is very, very Old Testament still in line. So that's, I think, why we had to do what we did. So otherwise, let's call it a day. Next time, what I'd like to do is to say, let's introduce the concept of Elohim and review it quickly, and then go to theos. And how does the word theos compare to the word Elohim, so that we can drop into John 1:1 and go from there. So, okay. All right. Thank you, everyone. We'll talk to you next time.